Reform UK party leader Nigel Farage wins back his seat in Parliament in a vote triggered by his resignation in protest against inquiries into his finances. A joke candidate came second as the main parties boycotted. So what's the wider political impact for UK politics? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bayes. The leader of the Reform UK party, Nigel Farage, has easily won a by-election triggered after he resigned in protest against inquiries into his finances. The main parties boycotted what they said was a stunt by Farage, who came top of a motley field of candidates in Clacton-on-Sea in Essex, which is near London. One, Count Binface, came second with nearly 10,000 votes. Farage says he's done nothing wrong and that the political establishment is out to get him. A parliamentary investigation stopped by his resignation is now resuming. Farage's right-wing Reform UK party had been leading national opinion polls with its hardline anti-immigration stance, but ratings slipped during the campaign, while the governing Labour Party has been helped by a new leader, Prime Minister Andy Burnham. So, could this by-election mark a turning point for Nigel Farage and his rivals? And will his political gamble pay off? We'll talk to our panel of guests in just a moment. But first, this report from Imran Ullah Khan.
A gamble that has paid off, for now. Reform UK leader Nigel Farage has regained his parliamentary seat, defeating his main challenger, Count Binface, in the Clacton by-election he triggered after resigning from his post last month.
I called this by-election because I wanted the people of Clacton, the voters of this constituency, to be my judge, not the mainstream media in Britain and the political establishment who paint us out to be criminals and bad people every day. So I asked the voters of Clacton to be my jury. Please. Today, the voters in Clacton have stuck two fingers up to the entire political establishment.
Farage received 22,239 votes, compared with Binface's 9,455, who dressed as an intergalactic space warrior, wearing a rubbish bin on his head. The UK's main political parties boycotted the by-election. Breaking with convention, Farage himself didn't attend the official vote count, his Reform UK party claiming police had advised there was a credible threat against him. Police later said there was no advice given to any candidate not to attend. The mood in Clacton following the results has been mixed.
Not what I'd hoped for, but what I thought would happen. But I mean, I imagine we'll be having another by-election quite soon, won't we?
Yeah, I think the right person won. I wish I betted on him, but it was quite a long odds. But let's hope he behaves himself, and hopefully it'll do good for Clacton.
Analysts say Farage used the contest to halt an investigation into gifts he received and never declared. In April of 2024, Farage received a $6.7 million gift from Christopher Harbin, a billionaire cryptocurrency investor. In July of that year, Farage won a seat in Parliament as MP for Clacton. Fast forward to May of 2026, Parliament's Standards Commissioner launched an investigation into whether Farage broke political rules by accepting the $6.7 million gift and not declaring it. On July 4th, British media reports a Farage ally, George Cottrell, paid for his staff and security during the 2024 general election. Cottrell was convicted of wire fraud in the US in 2017. On July 7th, Farage resigns as an MP but will stand for re-election. The move suspends the parliamentary investigation. And on August 14th, Farage is declared the winner of the Clacton by-election. The parliamentary investigation into Farage reopens, just hours after the results came in. Farage has denied any wrongdoing and states the Clacton results prove that the public don't care about his finances. But with the investigation back in the limelight, one political spectacle has ended for Farage, while another has just been revived. Imran Ullah Khan, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
So, complete absurdity and some real political issues. We'll touch on the first and then focus on the second with our guest today on Inside Story. In London, Peter Geoghegan, editor of Democracy for Sale. In North Yorkshire in England, Andy Preston, a former Mayor of Middlesbrough and political commentator. And we have Peter Oborne, the journalist and political commentator, who joins us today from Islamabad. Let me start with you, Peter Oborne, because we cover a lot of politics on this programme. 24 hours ago, I was discussing the elections in Zambia. Well, rarely have I seen an election as odd as the one that took place in Clacton. You're currently 8,500 kilometres away from Clacton. What do people there make of this?
I'll say it's top of the agenda here in Islamabad. We got our own problems here, I dare say. But I think that it is a serious matter. I mean, let's just go rehearse what happened. The Parliamentary Standards Commissioner launched an investigation into the fact that Nigel Farage had failed to declare a £5 million donation made shortly before the Clacton by-election, the general election last 2 years ago. Farage then dreamt up a wheeze or a stunt in which he appealed to the voters of Clacton. He resigned his parliamentary seat, and costing the taxpayer about £250,000 to go through the rigmarole of a vote which Farage presented as being designed to clear his name. He was going to invite the voters of Clacton, which is said to be the most right-wing constituency in the country. They were given a private referendum, in effect, on whether or not Farage had failed to declare this donation and abused his position. Now, that was his idea, and the other parties said, no, we're not going along with this. We're not going to join in. So there was no Conservative, no Labour Party, no Green Party figure. And now we have this absurd situation where the Standards Commissioner has resumed his investigation, and we await the finding. And I think what Farage is open to the charge of is wasting a lot of people's time, wasting a lot of people's money, and rather a sinister attempt to in effect threaten the Standards Commissioner, or at any rate pervert the course of justice, or interfere with the course of justice, as one might say.
Andy Preston will deal with all of those serious issues throughout this discussion, but it ended up with a situation where you had fringe candidates and freak candidates and Nigel Farage, and his main opponent was a man with a trash can on his head. You would say only in Britain, but does this make the country a bit of a laughingstock?
Yes, it does make Britain a bit of a laughingstock. It absolutely does. And I think that the list of candidates was so long. Apparently, if you or I stood up, the piece of paper that lists them all goes up to our hip. I mean, it's preposterous and it's absurd and it's a circus. And truthfully, it's a circus of Nigel Farage's making. He's been desperate. He's been under extraordinary pressure with accusations which may or may not be true flying around. His party has been slipping in the polls and they're starting to fight in public. And I think that what he wanted was some approval. He wanted to coalesce his supporters around him. And he thought, I'll call a by-election. I'll win it by a mile, which he did. He was right. But it has horribly backfired. It's backfired on Britain, but it's backfired on him. It hasn't stopped any investigation. It hasn't stopped any rumours. And he looks very foolish because every time he's going to be photographed now, or many times, shown in the paper, there's going to be a bin next to him.
Peter Geoghegan, I mean, there is a history in Britain of satirical candidates in elections. In fact, this Count Binface, it's not his first appearance in an election. He was standing against Andy Burnham in another recent by-election in the UK. I mean, one question comes to mind to me. Why Aren't people not forced to use their real names when they're registering in elections? Why are they allowed to fight elections as cartoon characters?
It's a long-running trend in British politics. If you go to any count, not just the election count, not count bin face, you will see, a whole gamut of characters dressed up in different clothes. We've had the monster raving loony party for decades, so it's becoming a bit of it's a trope of British politics. Whenever the Prime Minister is standing in their seat, they're going to end up standing next to someone who's in costume of some description. But we've never seen a kind of result like this. Count Binface himself said he did 10,000% increase on his vote share in the Makerfield by-election, which Andy Burnham won recently. But I think there's a kind of, the fact that he was the only candidate is part of the larger picture here, though. I think it's worth remembering. The reason there wasn't any other candidates, there wasn't candidates from the established parties, was because all the established parties basically said, Nigel Farage is calling this election for himself. They called this bluff, effectively. Nigel Farage is, as Peter Oborne says, was trying to get rid of the Standards Commissioner inquiry. There's actually reporting that suggests that his own staff thought that they could, by calling this election and winning the Standards inquiry, would end, which isn't the case. As your news package explains, it now starts again, basically as soon as he's re-elected. But he hoped that this would turn into a victory lap for him. He would be able to run against other candidates who'd win. All the other parties very quickly said, we're not going to stand, so you're going to be on your own. And so that's why we ended up with Count Binface. And I think a lot of other candidates, joke candidates, decided to pile in. It was the longest ballot paper in British history. It actually cost the council quite a lot of money extra to print it because it was so long. I think it was 3 feet long.
So, Peter Oborne, he did this to deflect against the charges against him. Just tell us what he is accused of and what now the investigations that now will be reopened.
Well, I'm going to refer you in a moment to Peter Geoghegan, who's the world's leading expert on political finance. But the fundamental thing, the biggest thing, is the failure to declare the £5 million donation he received from Christopher Harborne, who is a Thai-based crypto financier. Isn't that correct, Mr. Geoghegan? Who gave him £5 million for reasons which Mr. Farage found very, very difficult to account for. He gave very differing explanations about why the money was needed and how he would spend it. And that is quite properly being looked into. A massive sum of money in the terms of British politics by the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, who one may recall looked very carefully into the finances of a now not entirely forgotten character called Boris Johnson several times before Mr. Johnson finally left as Prime Minister.
So, Peter Geoghegan, tell us a little bit more about this inquiry. The money from this financier, Christopher Harborne, who also has a Thai name, Chakrit Shakun Krit. But that's not the only thing, the only allegation that Nigel Farage is now facing.
No, there's actually a series of allegations. So the current Standards Commission inquiry is this supposed gift, £5 million that was given from Christopher Harborne to Nigel Farage ahead of the 2024 general election. And in the UK, without getting too into the weeds on this, but in the UK, prospective MPs, if they get elected, they have to write down any donations or any gifts they got that were worth over £300 that, and this is the keyword, could be perceived to do with their political career, to do with their election. So Nigel Farage's argument is this had nothing to do with his election, nothing to do with his politics. It wasn't a political donation, it was a gift to him from Mr. Harborne. The problem with this line for Nigel Farage is, for one thing, he was the chairman of the Reform Party when he got this money. He also technically owned the company that controlled Reform at the time, the Reform Company. Not only that, the money came just before he became an MP, and Nigel Farage himself said he got it for his services to Brexit, which itself is a political project. So it's very problematic, I think, for Farage, this £5 million gift. But as you say, it's not the only issue. So at the moment, there's actually not pure clarity on whether the Standards Commissioner is investigating the second tranche, which I'll talk about in a second. I think he probably will, which is a guy called George Cottrell, whose nickname is Posh George. George Cottrell is a convicted fraudster, convicted in the United States. There's been a series of revelations in the British press and the Sunday Times about how he was working and helping Nigel Farage ahead of the 2024 general election, including paying for staff for Farage, for 3 different staff members. None of this was declared either, and that, I think, is very clearly political activity, very clearly activity should be declared. That will probably also be part of if not a separate Standards Commission investigation, possibly rolled into this. And as well as that, and I don't want people to get too confused, there's also separate police inquiries into money that went to Reform around the same time, ahead of the 2024 general election. There's money that went to Reform from a woman called Fiona Cottrell, who's George Cottrell's mum. The police are investigating whether those sources, where those sources of money actually came from. Was it from an impermissible donation? So there's a lot of questions spiraling around Reform and their money. And already this morning on British media, both Nigel Farage and some of his kind of surrogates have been saying, look, there's nothing to see here, let's move on. I think this is not going to move on. The Standards Commissioner is going to look into this, and there's every chance the Standards Commissioner will find a serious breach, in which case we could be here again with another by-election for Nigel Farage.
So, Andy, I mean, Nigel Farage, of course, is going to say that he was judged by the people in his constituency, and they voted for him again, slightly better than last time. Of course, he didn't have any real opposition this time. Tell us a bit about Clacton. Does it represent England? Does it represent the UK? Is it typical?
It is not typical of England or the UK, but it is very typical of the kind of place that has support and sympathies for Nigel Farage and the aims of his party and similar groups. Typically forgotten places, typically places that are rife with poverty and the long-term effects of that. They're sometimes described as forgotten places. They're often out on a limb, on a coastline, miles from a big city. And it's prime fertile ground for parties like people like Nigel Farage. But what's really interesting here is actually that this is a Nigel Farage story. But what people who aren't that familiar with British politics need to get is that Nigel Farage is Reform. Reform is a political party, but it is effectively a one-man party. It's effectively a Nigel Farage fan club. Forgive me for that phrase, but I think it really is. And as Nigel Farage hits trouble and becomes less popular, he's still popular, but he's becoming less popular. Reform's popularity has been falling too. And I personally think that Nigel Farage is feeling the heat. I think he feels under extraordinary pressure, and he had an emotional knee-jerk reaction to a range of allegations that may or may not be true. And he wanted to get some support and approval from his core group, which is Clacton. So what Nigel Farage did was he wanted to get 40, 50, 60% of the vote, which he did. Good luck to him, but it hasn't worked. It hasn't stopped the rumours, it hasn't stopped the inquiry. And I believe that Reform are now joint with Labour, leading the opinion polls in Britain, but they were miles ahead just a year ago, even less than that, miles ahead. And all the signs to me, as someone who observes these things, is that Reform are now starting to ebb. And the senior figures within it are infighting, and they're doing that publicly, which is usually the beginning of the end politically.
It's worth saying that we did ask someone from Reform. We approached the party to have a spokesperson on this programme, and they did not get back to us, Peter Oborne. You heard there Andy talk about it being a one-man party, but there were quite a lot of people from the Conservative Party, including pretty senior figures, who joined Nigel Farage in recent months as his popularity has grown. Do you think there might be some buyer's remorse now?
Yes, there may be a figure. Let's name some of them. Robert Jenrick is, I think I'm right in thinking, is one who has very extreme views on immigration, and there are about half a dozen or more very former cabinet ministers who jumped onto a bandwagon, which one rather fears from their point of view might be grinding to a halt, and that will indeed be a lot of feeling that they wish they remained the same. And so far, the Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, she is making it clear she doesn't want these grifters back again. And so I think there is a crisis at the heart of the reform establishment, if that is what one would call it.
Well, what we're going to have now is this parliamentary standards inquiry continue and potentially another by-election. Let's just a slight break from the seriousness to bring in that man with the trash can on his head, because he certainly thinks there's going to be another by-election.
I've had over 9,000 votes, guys. Now, in Makerfield, 8 weeks ago, I got 95 votes. So against Nigel Farage, compared to Andy Burnham, I am 1,000 times more popular. Does that have anything to do with why he isn't here tonight, on a night when they said they thought they'd get over 80%? Again, I'll leave that to you. All I will say to you is what happens next. Let's all meet for part 2 of the Clacton by-election, coming soon to a leisure centre near you.
Peter Geoghegan, another by-election, potentially expensive. This is becoming tedious, not funny any longer, is it?
I think that will be the kind of analysis in general for most voters if and when it happens. If there's another by-election, I think it's very likely other parties will stand. The Conservatives have held a seat before. You'd imagine they will have to stand. They'll be under pressure to stand, because it will be a formal by-election caused by a parliamentary process in which the Standards Commissioner issues a suspension for Nigel Farage. So other parties that you'd expect will stand. You'd still expect Nigel Farage to win on the back of this, but I don't think, I'd agree with Andy there, I don't think this solves anything for Nigel Farage. I think, he will win another election. He'll say, look, the slate has been wiped clean, and in that respect it will be the end of that particular standards process, although, as I mentioned, there will also there's a police investigation into other aspects of reforms funding, so that story is actually not going to go away. And you'd imagine that both the Conservatives and Labour and any other parties too will just put the £5 million on the back of their adverts for now and for the next 3 years. And they're no closer, Farage is no closer to giving any reasonable answers to this financial questions. He said it's like it was like a small lottery win. He says it's nobody's business what he's done with this money. And I think these questions will continue to haunt them. And I was at Reform's conference about this time last September. The party was very bullish. They were polling around 30% at the time. I was at fringe meetings where they were talking about polling up to 35%. There was a real sense of momentum behind the party. That has really ebbed, and it's actually not just because of Farage's finances. They didn't do as well in the 2026 local elections as they hoped to do. They didn't do very well in some very high-profile by-elections this year as well. They lost in Makerfield, but also in Gorton and Denton. Their polling numbers are going down. And this infighting, I think, is really, really significant too. We're seeing Zia Youssef, their head of policy, said this week that Ben Wallace, the former Defence Secretary, he described him as a traitor. Suella Braverman, who's another former Conservative, said that they can't, when the police today, as you reported, said that there was no problem, Nigel Farage could have attended this count. Suella Braverman, a former Conservative Home Secretary, said that the police couldn't be trusted. These are quite extreme positions, and Reform, if they're going to do well, are going to need to bring in people who are a bit wavering about Nigel Farage. You think he might be a bit too extreme? And at the moment, they're actually doing the opposite. They're going to be putting off those voters, and that's one of the reasons I think their poll numbers are going down. And so there's a real sense of momentum lost behind them, and I'm not sure another by-election is going to change that.
Andy Preston, you're a former mayor of Middlesbrough, a former Conservative mayor of Middlesbrough. Isn't there a problem for the whole of the right now, a fragmentation of the right? You've got Reform, Conservative Party, your party perhaps going a bit up in the polls, but there's also another group led by a chap called Rupert Lowe called Restore. Isn't this a problem, the fragmentation of the right?
It is a problem, but it's kind of the way that politics works. I'll correct you on one thing there, James. I was an independent mayor of Middlesbrough. I didn't belong to any party, and I'm still not a member of any party. I'm a donor, for clarity. I am a Conservative Party donor, but I'm not a member. But it's really interesting because I've agreed with almost everything that both Peters have said. But I'm not sure that Nigel Farage, if there is another by-election, will win it. And it's for the reason that you're asking now about the right being split. Now, there's a party called Restore, which many people think of as to the right of reform. You've on the right side of centre, you've basically got the Conservative Party, the traditional centre right. Then you've got Reform, and then you've got Restore, run by a man called Rupert Lowe. Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage were best of friends and have become the worst of enemies. They can't bear each other. Rupert Lowe's Restore Party will field a candidate if there is another by-election in Clacton. I'm sure of that. Nationally, they're polling at about 3-4%, but in a place like Clacton, I think Restore would feasibly take 10 to 15% of the vote. And that would cannibalise Reform. And the Conservatives are naturally fairly strong there. They held the seat until recently. So while I think it is a prime fertile ground for Nigel Farage and Reform, I think the presence of Restore in the next by-election, if it comes, would be a severe threat to Nigel Farage and further hasten the implosion, the potentially impending implosion of Reform.
Peter Oborne, this is all very good timing for Prime Minister Andy Burnham, is it not? You always get a bit of a bounce, a little bit of a honeymoon as a new Prime Minister. This is all happening in August when Parliament's not sitting, and it's good news, is it not, for the Prime Minister?
Can I add something, first of all, to what Andy was saying from North Yorkshire, the centre of the most beautiful county and the universe, as he knows. I think it's very good news indeed for Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives, because we're seeing the collapse of these two far-right parties, and the Conservative Party is going to benefit from that. I hope not too much, because there's going to be this temptation politically for Kemi Badenoch to move to the far right in order to sweep up these racist votes, which have been particularly appealed to. And I think that would be a great pity. I think that because the Conservatives have to be broader. But I think it's very good news for Badenoch. And I think, you're right. Andy Burnham was basically put into office as Prime Minister by the Labour MPs and cabinet ministers who were terrified at the rise of Reform. And Andy's sort of a northerner. He's much more real and authentic than the previous Prime Minister. And I think it's making his task of smashing the far right, much easier.
Thank you very much, Peter Oborne, Peter Geoghegan and Andy Preston on today's Inside Story. If you missed any of our discussion, don't worry. You can go back and watch it again. We always post the whole programme on YouTube and our website, aljazeera.com. We'd love to hear what you think too. Go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or on X, when you comment there, tag us. We are at AJ Inside Story. That's it from me, James Bays, and the team here in Doha. Until next time, stay tuned. Al Jazeera's coverage from around the world continues in a moment.